Today I'm going to do a brief review of the Vosteed Corsair, but I'm also going to try to answer a question. How strong should the spring tension actually be? I have a lot of crossbar locks on the table, and hopefully we can answer that question by taking a look at what works and what doesn't work with this style of locking mechanism. Let's start with the Vosteed Corsair. We're going to take everything out for the time being, and we'll bring it back in a little bit. So one thing I love about this company is they have the best generic clip of almost any brand out there, and they do everything right with it. We have recessed screws. It's completely flush with the frame. Everything about this clip is correct. All right. Not only that, it is reversible as it should be on a ambidextrous lock. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Then to cap everything off, we have a nice blade shape, really good grind, great steel with Nitro V, a good price at around, I think this is $79. Correct me if I'm wrong, future self. But yes, I think it's also a very good value for something that has full steel liners, very, very good fit and finish, and amazing action. That's the big punchline with this knife. It also comes with this little added bonus, which is a pocket clip insert as well as an extension that makes the handle a little bit different in feel. So that is an option that you can do, and you can actually replace this standoff and replace it with this micarta lanyard spot, which kind of basically fills in this little area. If you imagine these points continuing, that's kind of what it does. It's really quite a good design, I have to say. In fact, one of the best designs with a crossbar lock under $80 that I've seen. That's pretty much the conclusion. It's a great value knife. It's all of that. But really what I want to talk about is the strength of this crossbar. It's one of the strongest spring actions I've ever seen on a crossbar lock. And that includes knives all the way up to the Benchmade Adamas. Now you would expect something like the Adamas would have a very strong crossbar lock. But actually, this I would consider to be just under middle range. Like, it's not particularly strong. This one is one of the strongest that I've ever seen. And like Metal Complex, I tend to feel like it's better for it to be too strong than too light. Personal preference. Because when I let this knife, I usually hand knives off to my wife just to see if she's interested in them, because I'm always kind of curious to see what isn't intimidating and so on. And the thing is she could not get this disengaged one-handed in any way. Like, she had to really work at it, and it kind of made her nervous, because when you're putting that much force, as you know, if you're putting a lot of pressure on something that is sharp, that's when injuries tend to happen. So there is a reason maybe where it shouldn't be so strong. But I gotta say, as someone who uses a lot of knives, I actually really like it. I feel like this is an absolute vault when it comes to lockup. Like, there's no movement whatsoever in this lock. And it has a real oomph to it when you throw out the blade. So maybe for someone who's really like proficient and enjoys crossbar locks already, this would be a really nice change, and maybe will give you a different feel from other knives. But I don't know if that's actually a good thing all the time. So at this point, let's go ahead and bring in all the other knives. I want to start by saying that this is the second time I have filmed this section, because after going through all of the crossbar locks, I realized there is a philosophy here that is easier to explain to people and kind of gives you the relationship between all the different characteristics. So there's a couple things we have to know when we're talking about crossbar locks. How wide is the handle? In other words, how your purchase really matters for manipulating this one-handed. How wide is the handle? The wider the handle, the easier it's going to be to manipulate. How strong is the spring tension is the second one. And how much traction do I get from the crossbar? And that has to do with how far it's sticking out from the body, and also the actual way it is cut. So all of those things come to bear and have to work together for it to kind of dictate whether it's good or bad. Does that make sense? Hopefully we'll be able to explain that through this process. So on the table, I have a couple that are really bad and a couple that are actually really good. So the first one that's really bad is this one. Now, this is a sub $20 knife that I had to try just because it was pretty interesting. D2, this really pokey 4-inch folding knife. And honestly, the action is really good, but there's a couple problems here. Number one is the handle is so narrow that it's very difficult to hold on to and not slide up on the blade with my fingers, which is a really scary thing to do in a knife that has this kind of drop. Also, the crossbar, look at how short the pull is. That's a really big problem as well, because it's just hard to get out of the way. That's what it comes down to. And the spring tension is really high. This is a danger zone knife. I would definitely not recommend. I think that this gets away with it because the spring tension is high. It does not expose that far past the handles, but because the handles are so wide, you can kind of, stay out of the way when this comes down. It's also on washers, which makes that a little bit slower, easier to get out of the way. But once again, not being, out far enough from the body and not having that much traction, I think kind of hurts this. The spring tension is a little high. I would say appropriate for this knife if this had enough traction. So that's kind of one of those knives that's kind of in the middle. And then these are some pretty good ones, good examples. We'll actually end with this one. This is from Schrade, and it's actually stands nicely proud from the body and has something in the middle range when it comes to spring tension. It's not light, it's not heavy. I would consider this spot on, pretty much spot on for that one. And the same thing is true with both of these from Ganzo, which is well known for using crossbar locks, 440C, and being under $20. Really good value knives, right? So both of these are actually quite excellent, and this one being my favorite by far. It's kind of a Rat Model 2 clone, and I actually think has better ergonomics and better steel and better mechanism, but hey, this one is another good example. But the best of the bunch, by a long shot, is the one from SRM. This is the 9201. It has just the right amount sticking out from the frame, and it has a corner that actually you can start to really feel it, which is good. It also has a lot of traction on the handle. It's tall. It's on washers. It's just has the purchase that I'm looking for. It even has sort of a cutout here that makes it a little bit easier to get my fingers in. So I would consider this the best of the bunch. It's probably why it's my favorite knife under $20, probably. But this is a good example of when it's done correct. Now let's move up to the next tier of knives, and we can see what we can find in that tier. Okay, so we're going to start getting a little bit more expensive, not a little bit, a lot more expensive in this set. And with the Corsair being easily the strongest crossbar lock on the table, it does a good job of getting the right combination. I think had this crossbar been tucked in more in the frame, people like Metal Complex probably wouldn't have enjoyed it. And then on top of it, you see all those different levels that are going on? That actually helps with traction as well. So had they made this more difficult to grip, people would not have liked it. The fact that it has all of those things together is what makes it possible to use with that strong spring tension. And that, I think, sort of starts to see the illustration here of what you're looking for when you're picking a knife. I think from now on, when I review them, I'm going to be addressing this combination. So this was a really useful video for me as well. Now, the other one that's kind of in a similar price point is this. This is from SRM. I forget the name of it. It's just a number, if I remember correctly, the 255L. This is so good. This knife is so good. Now, the spring tension on this is really soft, but it just feels appropriate for the width of the handle, the traction of the handle, the exposure of the thumbs of the, what are we calling these? The studs, and which is just enough. It's like perfect. And there's a reasonable, okay amount of traction. I could use a little bit more if the spring tension was higher. Really like this one. This is actually one of my favorites in that category, that $60 to $70 category. The other one that's in that same price point is the Roboto 2, which is OEM by Kaiser. We're going to be talking about Kaiser knives a little bit at the very end, but this is one of my favorites. I would argue that you could increase the tension on this knife for sure, and you can see how it's bouncing instead of pulling in. That tells me that, like, and you'll see this in other knives, they don't have that problem. Well, I guess this doesn't really either, but they won't spring back. There's just too much pushing against the tang of the blade, pulling it down for it to bounce back out. So I think that's a good example of a knife that's definitely just on the light side, but still probably my favorite one from O-Knife or Kaiser OEM. We're going to leave this to the end, actually. It's an important one to leave to the end. Now we get into some really premium knives, okay? So, of course, we have the 940, which I argue, yeah, it's just about right, honestly. They kind of had this dialed in from the get-go, but that's not surprising after all. They're the ones who had exclusive rights to the axis lock for the longest time. And the 940, absolutely within realm. See, I can use one finger. There's enough traction. I can use one finger instead of two. And I think the ideal amount of traction would allow me to grip this without slipping off of it in any way, whether it's wet or dry conditions. So that would be very, very good. Right now, though, I think that the king of crossbars has to be Hogue. And it's the things that some people dislike that I think makes them the number one. Number one, their thumb studs are so bitey. They have so much traction. I just absolutely adore the thumb studs and the crossbar lock. I know not everyone does because they say, oh, it's too much. It's perfect, in my opinion. It is. They're perfect because you, even in wet conditions, you are not slipping off the thumb stud as I just slip off the thumb stud. No, you're not slipping off the thumb stud. And I think that's what I'm showing here is if I can slip off this, then the other ones definitely have too little. And the same thing is true with the crossbar here. I can absolutely pull this back one-fingered, right? And manipulate this knife without feeling like I'm sliding around on the blade. I'm just always amazed that these are on washers and they're that smooth. Whew, crazy. Yeah, the Deca, phenomenal. Same thing goes with the Hogue made RSK, which is a collaboration with Doug Ritter. This is the MagnaCut version. Oh, so good. And once again, I think that with the higher tension that this has compared to Deca, and it's definitely higher, it's perfect to have that extra, like, texture, both on the handle, but also on the crossbar and the width of the handle. Once again, I think this makes it this is why this is one of my favorite knives maybe ever made, because it has that perfect combination to be used with a crossbar. Nice wide handles, plenty of places to make sure I'm locked in without getting in front of the blade. It's good texture, the right amount of tension. All these things are great. These are phenomenal. And then we get to the Adamas, where things are just not quite right. And it's not, I like the thumb studs and I like the texturing on the crossbar, but they got in trouble because the spring tension here is really low. Really, really low for what it should be, which is the strongest on the table, as it has an even thicker blade than the RSK. And there's a larger version of this knife as well. And I think I tried that one. I didn't like it quite as much. And it had approximately the same tension. It made me honestly a little bit nervous. So there is this relationship also with the weight and the size of the blade. Generally speaking, it's safer to increase the tension on the Omega spring, right? If you have a heavier blade. That is the other conclusion I can make. Now, that brings us to the clutch lock, which is kind of an adaptation of the crossbar lock. And inside are little holes. And those little holes allow you to adjust the tension of the Omega spring kind of on the fly. So you can have it as low or as high as you want. I think Kizer outdid pretty much everyone in this category, just blew them away, because by having that, you can adjust it depending on what size blade you have and what feels correct. And they also managed to also add a little bit more texture to the crossbar, and as you can see, it stands proud of the handle, exactly as it should be. This is why I think the clutch lock is so popular. But if you're not going to have something that's adjustable, it needs to be properly tuned for that particular knife. Notice how much more the Corsair's buttons stick out, even across, compared to this or this one. I think these are all pretty good, actually. See, nice, that's about right. But like, it really does matter how far from the body they stick out, because the ones that are bad, the ones that are bad, like this, look at how big of a difference that is. That's a big difference. And I think it matters. I really do. So I hope that maybe poses some interesting questions for everyone to talk about, and I'm curious to see what your opinions are down in the comments. Do you think a crossbar lock should be stronger? Am I right in that there's a relationship between the thickness of the handle and the texture on the button and so on? And maybe I've missed something also quite important that is a factor as well. Let me know. As always, thank you guys so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon.